Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and welcome to the webinar, which is called Opportunities and Practices for Soil Carbon Management in Central West New South Wales, presented by Schefe and Dr. Abe Gibson, and brought to you by CRC. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are coming from today, which is the Wiradjuri land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Diana Fear, and I am CEO of Central West Farming Systems, and with me is Chiara Stommel, who is our trials agronomist. Just letting you all know that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to registered attendees and put on CWFS's YouTube channel and the Soil CRC website. So if you have any issue about being recorded, just put your hand up or let me know. Just a few instructions there. On the right-hand side of your screen there will be a chat box, so feel free to put your questions in there throughout the presentations. And at the end of the webinar, there'll be discussion time. And look, if it's particularly pertinent to a slide, we will interrupt the speakers who don't mind, and we can get that question sorted out straight away. So today's webinar is actually the third of 7 webinars presented by CRC, supported by New South Wales Government as part of the Primary Industries Productivity and Abatement Program, PIPAP. PIPAP is providing information to land managers about carbon farming to help make evidence-based decisions. Oh, thank you, Cassie, for putting that up. So the first webinar, we heard how visualising Australasian soils and the New South Wales eSpade provides spatial soil and land characteristics to assist with soil carbon planning. At the second webinar, we learn about interpretation of soil data and land capability for considering a soil carbon project, including the factors above and below the ground impacting soil carbon, interpreting soil data to assess land suitability for increasing soil carbon, and also identifying opportunities for additional land management practices to optimise soil carbon. Recordings of these webinars can be found at the New South Wales DPIRD website and the Soil Network of Knowledge website. Today, our presenters will focus on our region and soils in our region, including soil carbon levels we can expect, the factors that influence soil carbon levels, and the management practices that can increase soil carbon levels. Cassie, can I get you to do the second slide? Is that the second slide? Yep. The next 4 webinars will be hosted by other grower groups in New South Wales and will cover specific land management activities suited to their local environment. So today I would like to introduce our 2 presenters. Dr. Abe Gibson is a research fellow at Southern Cross University with extensive expertise in soil sciences, particularly focusing on soil chemistry, soil carbon sequestration and climate change processes. His work emphasises improving soil health and productivity while exploring sustainable strategies to enhance carbon capture in agricultural systems. Abe's research aims to integrate these findings into practical management techniques for farmers, making a measurable impact on both environmental sustainability and agricultural productivity. Our other speaker today is, I know a lot of people will know Cassie from other work she's done with CWFS. So Dr. Cassandra Schefe. Cassie is a soil scientist with over 25 years experience in identifying and addressing soil constraints with a deep technical understanding of soil sea dynamics within farming systems. Through her business, AgriSci, Cassie works with farmers, industry and academia to support sustainable food production. She holds an adjunct position with Charles Sturt University and has authored over 20 scientific journal papers and numerous conference proceedings. She's also accredited as both a certified professional soil scientist by Soil Science Australia and as a FERTCare accredited advisor. So we're going to start with Cassie first. So Cassie, I'm handing it over to you. And remember everybody just to put any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Di, for that introduction. And thank you to the Soil CRC and New South Wales Government and partners for inviting me to be with you today. And really what we're going to go through today is it's really just some of the basic stuff around where we're up to with soil carbon and then what opportunities there can be to increase. And particularly when Abe steps up after I'm finished my section, then we'll talk through some of the recent trials that have been happening and results from those. But we're going to keep it quite simple today and just start with the basics. So in terms of what we'll be covering, we'll have a bit of a refresh of what soil carbon looks like, some of the factors that affect carbon levels in our soil, what we can do to improve those levels or mitigate loss, looking at the impact in mixed and cropping systems, and then they will be talking us through some of the trial results from current work. So first of all, just to put context and some regional relevance to what we'll be talking through today, it's no surprise to you of the environment that you live in, and really just to kind of put it out there in terms of the environmental and climatic conditions experienced in the Central West region. So as you can see from this really nice graph that came from the Central West website, is there's a really strong gradient in rainfall from west to east through the region. And as we'd expect, this does have a strong influence on our soil carbon levels. But more than that, it also has an influence on the productive systems that happen within this region. So a lot of diversity in terms of the management of mixed and pure cropping systems, and obviously a lot of pure livestock there as well. So the different intensity of enterprises, the different types of businesses involved, all have different opportunities for what can be done in terms of monitoring and managing our soil carbon in our systems. So if you look again from these lines of rainfall, we're going from about 400 up to around 600 by the time we get east of Parkes. So if you look at this based on some recent research that's been done in these regions, we can actually start to see what expectations we could have around soil carbon levels associated with these rainfall conditions. So if you look at this work by Anderson Badgery, we can see that as we go from from low levels of annual rainfall, increasing to really high levels, as we would expect, there's also an increase in the average organic carbon levels in those soils. And we can see with this graph that we've got both the 0 to 10 and the 10 to 20 centimetre results there. The key message from this is in the Central West system, when we're working in these quite low rainfall zones, our expectations of what we can achieve with soil carbon also have to reflect what those conditions look like. So levels of between 1 and 1.3%, 1.5% in these systems would be amazing. So really need to set that expectation of what we can do and really see the key one of the key drivers of carbon is obviously rainfall. But if we take a step back, rather than saying, well, this is how carbon is made, if we just focus back onto actually how soil carbon is made, it all comes down to the plant. We know that the key way we can get carbon from the atmosphere through to the soil is through photosynthesis, is through plant growth, where the plant actually captures that atmospheric CO2, pulls it in through the stomata, adds water, converts it to glucose and oxygen. So that is the key method that we use in order to access that CO2 from the atmosphere and store soil carbon. What we know then is as those plants die, microbes break them down, and then that converts them into organic matter. Those microbes die, they get broken down by other microbes. We start to get a breakdown of material to the extent that we can't really see what it was comprised of before. We start talking about humus at that point. It's a non-definable organic material. Through this process, from plant through to organic matter in the ground, if there's a net accumulation of carbon in this process, we can say that carbon from the atmosphere has been captured or sequestered in soil. So that's the key method of carbon sequestration. However, what we know is that this process is not perfect. We know that microbes like us, a lot of the microbes in our system, breathe in oxygen and they breathe out CO2. So we've got all this organic matter in the system, but by default we have organic matter, we also have a lot of microbes. So you have a healthy soil, lots of microbes, lots of respiration, lots of loss of carbon from the system through CO2. In addition, we also have nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases being lost through this system as well. So it's really not a perfect process. But I just wanted to get this in people's mind around the key way that we bring carbon into soil is through growing plants. It's not kind of an immediate access process.
Cassie, can I just ask you a question that has come up on the chat? Does the spread of rainfall change the possible soil carbon as well as total rainfall?
So the results that I showed before were averaged over large areas and different systems, but we know that fundamentally it's attached to plant biomass and plant growth. So if we have a big dump of rain in summer, we might get some plant growth through that. We'll also get a lot of loss of carbon through emissions over that time as well. Whereas if that rainfall is spread through the year in a way that facilitates really good plant growth, we will actually get more ability to hold that carbon. So season to season, there will be changes, but that variation is built into the error or the variance around those numbers that we showed. So if we then look at around that climate piece a bit more, we can see why our different rainfall zones have a different capacity to hold carbon. So we know that in our tropical and subtropical regions, the moist conditions and the high biomass inputs and the high biological capacity all combine to enable a lot more conversion of plant material into organic matter. The other key driver of potential soil carbon values in our systems is our soil type and condition. And we know that the soil types within the Central West region do vary significantly, with areas of really light sandy soils all the way through to some really deep heavy clays. And these soils also vary in their capacity to hold carbon. We know that our sandy soils have very little chemical binding capacity, so very little ability to hold on to organic matter, whereas our clay soils have a higher surface area and a greater amount of charge, which means that they can bind with that organic matter quite well. We also know that low pH soils can build less carbon, and we'll talk about pH a little bit more in a sec, specifically due to their impaired microbial function. As we reduce our pH levels, we get less functional biology in our systems. We also know that if we have crusting, dispersive or compacted soils, we'll also have less ability to hold carbon because we've got less oxygen moving through, less water moving through, and less ability for that plant to grow. So within this, we really want to be addressing and ameliorating our key constraints before focusing on any form of soil carbon accrual. So focusing on what we need for the plant rather than focusing on the soil itself. The key thing to pull out of this is that every soil has a threshold carbon capacity. If we look at that scale of diminishing returns, every soil has a limit where there's less and less capacity for that soil to hold carbon. And so we can continue to increase our organic inputs into that soil, continue to do more stuff. But as we get towards the top end of this curve, we're going to reduce our ongoing increases in that system. We'll be maintaining, but will take so much more energy and resources to continue to improve. So the key point of this is between the rainfall story, the climate story and the soil type story, knowing where the Central West region fit into that is really to manage the expectations around what's possible in your soils. So the key thing we can do, as I've flagged before, is looking at the constraints in the system. What do we need to do to enable the plants to grow the best that they can, which then enables that organic matter cycling and microbial function to do its job. So it's really about that, the leaky bucket, the law of the minimum. You know, what's the key thing that's constraining the whole system that needs to be addressed in order for everything else that you're doing to add value? So in a lot of our soils, we know that soil pH and soil acidity is generally the most limiting factor for plant growth in our productive farming systems. Many of our plant species can't grow well and persist at low pH values, specifically a lot of our legumes. Many nutrients are also less available. We get poor plant growth response to our applied fertilisers, so we can keep applying more and more, but we just don't get the plant oomph that we should be getting from them. We have reduced microbial function, so a lot of the nutrient cycling and breakdown that we should be occurring doesn't happen in low pH soils. We have poor rhizobium inoculation of our legumes. We have poor persistence of lucerne stands. Everything just doesn't have the guts that it should. The other thing that we don't tend to consider is that we also end up with poor nitrogen mineralisation from organic matter. So we're not getting the value of that organic matter in the system for our end supply into our plants. But once we've done the right thing and we've addressed those constraints, we've done everything well. And for example, we've ended up changing our subclover pastures from something that looks a bit dodgy on the right through to a really healthy plant on the left. We've done everything well. The key thing then is to ensure that there's not something else that's limiting plant growth, so that you get the real value out of the inputs and effort that you've put in. In terms of these constraints themselves, we've talked about acidity, but the other things that can influence our ability to hold and support plant growth and hold carbon are things like soil sodicity, and there's patches of that through Central West, which results in poor soil structure, water infiltration and plant establishment. There's patches of salinity that can decrease the ability of the plant to take up water, which results in poor vigour and persistence of the preferred species. There's compaction issues, which reduce the ability of plant roots to penetrate and access water and nutrients. Potentially waterlogging and drainage issues I was going to say the rare years where water is in excess, but those have been a bit more than normal lately. So a lot of waterlogging issues going on, which reduces the availability of oxygen to roots and microbes and shuts down a lot of plant growth and micro function. And then there's nutrient deficiencies and toxicities, which reduce plant vigour and competitiveness. So really the common theme through all this is that if we want to increase our chances of holding carbon and building carbon, we really need to look at optimising our plant growth and removing anything that could be stopping those plants from growing well. Once we do that, by that same process, we're also ramping up microbial function as well. So we've got healthy plants, healthy microbes, systems that are working, best ability to get things cycling. In terms of what we can actually do in terms of carbon in our soils, there's probably a few elements to it. We've talked about the constraint amelioration to grow the best plant possible. Then we look at our biomass inputs. So we know that legume-based pastures and pulses have the best, one of the best things that we can do over the long term to increase our soil carbon levels. And this is due to the input of those biomass. So perennial pastures and legumes have a high biomass input into the system. And because they're legume-based, they've also got a high organic nitrogen component, which helps in terms of organic matter breakdown and building of that carbon. In all the long-term trials that have been done on soil carbon in Australia, the key practices that will infer greatest potential to build carbon all include a legume in the system. The other thing is around crop residues and managing those in our systems as much as we can. Most of those residues are high carbon residues. So again, having a legume in the system or adequate nitrogen helps in those being broken down well. And then finally, something that's a bit of a no-brainer for every livestock and mixed enterprise is around ground carbon management. If we're removing all the biomass from the system, we can't increase carbon if we don't have any carbon there to increase. In addition to all the other benefits of ground carbon management in terms of reducing soil erosion, increasing infiltration and generally supporting better soil structure. The last thing is around system fertility. So I mentioned nutrients, but really to flag that we can't maintain or grow our soil carbon in our system without adequate nutrients. And just to provide a bit more context and numbers around this, is that over the last 6 years in the Cool Soil Initiative, we've sampled over 1,600 soil samples through northeast Victoria and southern New South Wales. All these soil samples have practice history associated with them in management. What we know from those is that the soils with the higher soil carbon levels all have a good pH status. Most of them have a legume history, and they all have good yield and productivity history. So they're being farmed well, which then means good plants, good yields, good biomass, good carbon. Across the range of these systems, we are seeing soil carbon values from about 0.7 up to 4.5. If we drill down into our Central West, we do have a few really low soil carbon levels, which are really in our deep sands of about 0.3, which is what we'd expect under quite limited rainfall and input conditions, up to around 2.5%. So having soil carbon values above 1.5% in the Central West region is really cool and really exciting, and can happen, but requires certain management to get there.
Cassie, can I just ask another question before you move on?
Yeah.
Have you seen any difference between lucerne versus clover-based pasture when it comes to soil carbon building?
We haven't drilled down to that level at this point. It's a really good question, Terry. What we've done in this analysis was quite simple and said basically plus or minus legume to split it. We're about to go through a real deep dive of this data to start to see if we can see those nuances. What I would expect is that there will be more variation in the value of some of our lucerne stands compared to a clover-based pasture. Knowing that most of our pastures have better well managed in terms of ground cover and biomass, whereas some of our lucerne stands are really good, and others are quite exposed and low biomass. Some of them have been overgrazed over time as well. So I think that you're probably likely to see more variation in the treatment effect of that lucerne stand. So just finally, I wanted to explore this fertility piece just a bit more before handing over to Abe. And just to say that we always talk about carbon in our organic matter, and we talk about carbon with everything, pretty much because carbon's what we can measure. But we know that organic matter is comprised of all these other nutrients, particularly a really strong relationship between carbon and nitrogen. If we don't have the nitrogen and even phosphorus in a system, we don't have that carbon. So that is a key limiter for our organic matter. There's been a number of international trials to show the really strong interaction between the two. And just two of them that I've pulled out is on the left-hand side, going down, some long-term replicated trial work to show that as we increase our nitrogen inputs, which is the N numbers from N0 up to N180 in a cropping system, and we do that consistently over time from 1985 through to 2009, that as we increase our nitrogen inputs, our soil carbon values, which is the y-axis, increase significantly compared to what's going to happen in our low nitrogen input systems. So it's clearly showing that relationship between nitrogen and carbon. The other set of data, which most of you may be familiar with, is from Clive Kirkby's work, showing that stoichiometric relationship between the nutrients. And it's very easy to see that the total soil carbon, total soil nitrogen relationship is incredibly strong. So if you don't have the nutrients, you can't hold the carbon. And the phosphorus and sulfur levels there also, show quite a strong relationship as well. So the last thing I wanted to touch on is that we talk about carbon increase all the time, right? But we know that we're doing everything well. Most of the practices that we're employing are best practice. Every farmer is trying to do things the best way they can. But there's a lot of farmers I talk to who say, look, I'm doing everything well, but my numbers aren't going up. And so then you sort of talk through it a bit more and say, well, okay, so let's say you've got a soil carbon number of 1%, which is just more for ease of calculations than anything else. If you've got 1% carbon now, and then over a season, and let's call it a cropping season to keep it simple, we know that we could pull out and mineralise up to 100 kilos of nitrogen over that time, which is then taken up by the plant, right? We talk about mineral N. That's quite doable, 100 kilos. We know that with our carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10:1, which is very strong, if we're pulling out 100 kilos of nitrogen from the organic matter for plant use, we will be losing up to a tonne of carbon through that process through microbial respiration and other reactions. So that's a straight pull, straight export. If those carbon and nitrogen values aren't replaced, if that nitrogen doesn't come back into the system, then we'll just keep depleting that soil carbon over time. So that's a straight mining effect. But if next year, or in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, you come back and measure the same spot in the paddock again, and you're still at 1% carbon, and you go, oh, I'm doing everything right, but my carbon numbers aren't going up. But 3 years' time, you're still at 1% carbon. Because of all the losses in the system through those mineralisation processes, to keep that 1% carbon means that you've actually pulled in 100 kilos of nitrogen and 1,000 kilos or a tonne of carbon every year to maintain that. So the key message is that in our highly productive food and fibre systems where we're withdrawing from our organic matter bank all the time, if we're still maintaining those levels, that in itself is a sign of sustainable farming. So it's a constantly fluxing system, and maintaining these numbers does require ongoing inputs. So I just the last thing that I wanted to contribute today was just to focus on, in our highly productive ag systems, maintaining soil carbon is actually an active thing that shows that you're doing a really good job. So that's me. So now I'm going to stop sharing and Abe's going to kick in. Carry on.
Thanks, Cassie. One is it? That one. How's that look for everyone? Oh, okay, good. You're a Teams user, unless we stick to Zoom. Sorry. So yeah, I guess just to follow on from Cassie and what Diana said before around the intro, I'll be talking about the role of plant, or the potential for plant diversity to build soil carbon in these cropping systems. And my results, or what I'm talking about today, is based on a trial that we're running with Central West, that's also mirrored with Riverine Plains down at Burrowmine. And then I'll also be drawing on some trial data from some single season data with Birchip Cropping Group, and also down in Victoria, and Facey Group in Southwest WA. And hopefully this all fits together really nicely with the that platform that Cassie's just set. Just before I start, I would like to thank Diana, Kiara, and Mitch, who I assume is not here and really busy at the moment, who managed the trial for us down at Central West. Jane and the River and Plains crew have also been really important for keeping these trials going and getting good data from them. Also, just like to thank everyone else at Southern Cross who's contributed to this, and then also Yolanda and the crew at BCG, and Tina and the crew at Facey, Felicity for getting this off the ground, and the farmers that host our trials. There's no trials without farmers that are willing to host us and put up with us coming and going and making annoying phone calls about filling up water tanks and stuff like that. So the focus for my presentation, or my part of the presentation today, is around plant diversity in cropping systems, and looking, I guess, specifically at just straight cropping systems, so not mixed enterprises. So if you've got things like a pasture phase, you have probably a greater scope to build soil carbon because of the continuity of inputs in those systems. And while a lot of people say it's easy to build soil carbon in mixed enterprises, it's a lot of work to maintain a mixed enterprise. Because it's hard to run trials with animals involved, our trials have just looked at straight cropping systems. And when I talk about plant diversity, we've been looking at summer cover crops, temporary intercropping. So that's growing wheat with vetch or clover in some years, and then spraying out that legume and taking the wheat to harvest. And then this year, because last year was a wheat year, for our canola year in our trials, we've looked at intercropping, where we'll take fava beans, field pea and canola grown in the same plot, both to harvest and see how that goes. And those that have sort of, I guess, dabbled in this space or have done their own research will, I guess, hear a lot about how we need to be growing summer cover crops. We need to be having plant diversity in our cropping systems through temporary intercropping or intercropping because of the benefits that that generates around soil health. And whether you see it as sustainable agriculture and best management practice, regenerative agriculture, there's a lot of claims that are made, and the evidence is really based on, I guess, data that's come out of temperate systems in the Northern Hemisphere. And what I'm going to talk about today is how that stuff doesn't directly translate. And so while these things or these systems show a lot of evidence for building soil carbon, and I'll explain that the underlying processes in these systems do have capacity to build soil carbon, there's a lot of challenges in Australian systems that when I go through this, if this isn't something that you are familiar with, you'll see and really appreciate the challenges that we have around building soil carbon in southern Australian cropping systems, so our winter dominant cropping systems. So just briefly to sort of define the benefits of these things and how they look in our system. So our summer cover crop is basically a cover that's grown in the fallow of our winter cropping system, and the benefits that, or I guess the processes that should be driving benefits around soil health and soil carbon in these systems is having living roots in the ground rather than a fallow, but also offering additional erosion control. But one of the main limitations that people see around summer cover crops is the use of water over that fallow period, but also the type of nitrogen as well. So some of you may be familiar with the work of John Kierkegaard that used APSIM to model the effects of winter weeds, not winter, summer weeds on water tie-up and nitrogen, and how that impacted, the negative impact that had on yield by having summer weeds over that fallow period. And so some people say, oh, summer cover crop, just grow the weeds that are there. But the other thing that we sort of want to look at is, can we have all this concept of functional diversity in our summer cover crops, where we use legumes, mix of brassicas and other things to try and, I guess, get that diversity of inputs into the soil system, make our microbes happy, and have that additional biomass to build our carbon. When we talk about intercropping, I spoke before, and so the results that I present today are from our temporary intercropping systems. But I also just like to show the photos of our true intercrop systems because they've been looking really good this year. While I won't talk too much about results in the true intercropping system, where we take both crops to harvest, there's the over yielding factor. So by having those two plants grown together, the complementary relationships between them, we have higher biomass, and that translates to higher yield. And then also exploiting things like nitrogen fixation when you grow a legume with another crop. And I just want to take a second to talk about that, because when we talk about plants being the interface of, I guess, carbon from the atmosphere into our soil, this higher biomass with the benefit of over yielding is really promising for building carbon in our systems. And as I go through and sort of explain some of the pitfalls with summer cover crops and not so much temporary intercropping, this system, it looks really promising, I guess, from my personal point of view, from what we've seen on the ground in our trials and coming from, I guess, the scientific principles behind building soil carbon. So I won't talk too much about this because Kathy's set this up really well, but if you can increase your, I guess, plant biomass, you have diversity in your plant system, so you have different root exudates, which promotes different kinds of microbes growing, supports a higher microbial biomass, then you can increase your soil carbon. When we have diversity in our plant system as well, we have other benefits that I guess are sort of at the forefront of being shown from a scientific perspective around better resource use efficiency in our plants and across our system that leads to better carbon. I have this diagram here because what I want to highlight is that this is one of the key diagrams that you'll see when people start talking about soil carbon. And the issue with this, when we talk about it in a cropping sense, I think this is sort of and working on other projects with carbon consultants and talking to farmers, a lot of the one of the key things that we miss is that our system looks like this for a few months of the year. So this is the drone shot of our trial at Central West. That's our summer cover crop plots, where you can see that biomass there, and then we have our stubble retention and our fallow in our other plots. So if we compare it to this nice system where we've got perennial plants and trees, we have constant soil carbon cycling. And what I'll talk about as I move through the presentation is that this fallow period is a bit of a barrier for us with building soil carbon in our system. Cassie talked really well about the benefits of soil carbon and why it's important. And I guess from a systems point of view, and for those of you that are on the ground working, you'll have consultants come to you and talk about your market opportunities, both formal, so registering a carbon project, but you also have informal opportunities around leveraging sustainability and environmental, I guess, credentials, environmental stewardship credentials into your supply chain. And so it's not always all about soil carbon projects. This, I guess, making money by selling your sustainability story is going to become more important. It's also really important for your social license moving forward. Cassie spoke really well about the environmental and, I guess, agronomic benefits of good soil health and soil carbon, so I won't go over those again. So if I jump into the trials, this is the spread of where they are throughout Australia. So our Central West trial, down in Gap there, our River Plains trial down at Barrowline, our BCG trial is over in the Mallee, and then we have our basic group trial that we talk about at the end over in Gilligan in southwest WA. So it's a bit of a geographic spread, but the basics around soil carbon building hold true across different climate zones and different soil types. Just your sealing sort of changes with your climate, and then also your soil type as well, how much carbon you can actually hold on to. So the trials at Central West and Riverine Plains are long-term trials, have been since 2019, and the BCG and the basic group trial are just a single season of data that gives a bit more temporal resolution on in-season variability of soil carbon parameters. So this is what has been grown at Central West since 2019. So we're here in 2024. There's been some ups and downs, like any cropping system, and then you sort of addition, like more exposed to that when you've only got small plot trial. So we have some issues with waterlogging, especially in 2022 in that really wet year, and it's the same story at Riverine Plains. So in the early part of the trials, we had buckwheat and a 4-species mix, which I refer to as low diversity, and then we moved to a 3 and 9 species mix post 2022. We sort of saw that as a hard reset. We didn't get any crops in 2022, and then you can see our temporary intercropping and our intercropping that's gone in this year with wheat and a legume there. And so the treatments I'll be referring to are low diversity, multi-species, and then maximum diversity for the Riverine Plains trial, and then temporary intercropping for the wheat vetch and wheat clover combinations. In terms of the characteristics of our sites, you can see, as I mentioned, with our geographic spread, there's quite a spread in rainfall and also soil types. But as I mentioned, the principles in building soil carbon hold true through space and time. And so while the numbers are going to be different between sites, there is applicability between them. So don't be too worried about making inferences between trials, as long as you understand the different limitations, and the limitations impact the absolute numbers, but relative numbers are really important. So the reason why we're here is soil carbon. So across the trial at Central West, there's been no significant change in soil carbon. So that's total soil carbon as a percent. There's some ups and downs, a potentially declining trend. So that 2022 year is missing. So maybe some issues around biomass there. But statistically speaking, no differences that we can sort of hang our hat on there. And we're sort of hovering around that 1.75 to 1.6% at Central West, so pretty high for the region compared to the numbers that we've seen so far. Now, rather than put up another total carbon graph for root plains, I'm actually going to put up some measures for labile carbon inputs. So WSC is water soluble carbon, HWEOC is hot water, extractable organic carbon, and then we've got microbial biomass carbon there on the bottom panel. So the water soluble and hot water extractable organic carbon are basically a representation of fresh inputs of carbon. So we like the stuff that's been put in the soil more recently through plant growth. And so I've used these because they can give a better indicator for, I guess, more immediate responses of soil carbon. And you can see they sort of match what we see in the total soil carbon at Central West, a little bit lower in the latter years, and but quite a bit of variability. Again, there's no treatment differences between our diversity treatments, but really high variability, just even within sampling for each year. And this is one of the key things to remember around soil carbon as well. We've only got 3 reps in our trials, but the variability is something that does sort of, I guess, show throughout all the trial sites. And so it's a bit of a non-result, but also a result in itself, as I'll sort of step through and hopefully explain over the next few slides. So if we think of biomass as a driver of our soil carbon, when we look at the limitation of summer cover cropping, our big limitation is that we can't produce a lot of biomass with our summer cover crops. You can see that there throughout the years of the trials, that our max biomass that we reached was 3.3 tonnes a hectare in that 2022 year, so really wet year. We weren't able to follow up with the cash crop, however. The last couple of years have been pretty promising, so that's sort of 1 to 2 tonnes to the hectare. But you can see at root plains really limited biomass in those biomass production from summer cover crops in the early years. And it's simply a climate thing. So you have sort of at these sites, you do have rainfall spread really evenly throughout the year, but you have really high evaporative demand in that summer period. And it just makes it really hard to grow reliable biomass for that summer cover crop year on year. And as I sort of move through the later results, the key thing that I want to compare this to is the biomass that we grow in our cash crop season. So you can see in our wheat years, we sort of grow anywhere from, for peak biomass, 3 to 14 tonnes per hectare biomass. Our clover and vetch intercrops sort of don't produce a lot of biomass. And then our canola, we've seen sort of on the range of 4 to 7 tonnes per hectare per year. So if we're comparing that with our annual input to what we can grow in a summer cover crop, our cash crop is where we're feeding our soil carbon, essentially. It's where we're producing most biomass. It's where we produce our reliable biomass. To quickly switch to the water dynamics for the summer biomass production, while year to year we don't see, and so the years are shown by the similar colours and then diversity by the different symbols. Within each year, we haven't seen results for water dynamics, but we do see a decreasing trend with increased summer cover crop biomass production. So now we've got this kind of issue where we want to be producing this for our carbon story, but if we're declining our water available at sowing, and so I've used the ratio of the water available at sowing compared to water in the summer cover crop treatments compared to the control. So anything below 1 means that we've used up more water than the fallow. So we want to produce this biomass, but we're trading off a little bit of water for that. We can see that trend, especially when we want to be targeting that 2+ biomass to sort of make an impact, and we want to be doing that regularly. So is that going to be impacting our yield? The answer is potentially not. And the driver of this is that our in-season conditions in the trial years so far have been more important to determining our yield than the water that's available at pre-sowing. So you can see, because they're grouped around that sort of straight line up from the profile water content of sowing, so our yield response ratio, so treatment to control, we sort of just get this scattergun with a lot of, I guess, vertical spread rather than horizontal or diagonal spread is what we'd be looking for if we were having an impact there. So there's, I guess, opportunity there that we can use summer cover cropping as an opportunistic practice. And then I haven't presented the temporary intercrop data because there's been no impact to yield from that data that we've collected so far. We really need more work to understand the trade-offs between biomass and yield, because there's no point growing biomass for soil carbon cycling or soil carbon building if we're going to have an impact on yield, or we need to find a way of compensating for that loss in yield, which I'll talk about at the end. And again, understanding those benefits that come from these systems, it needs more work in Australia, and that's why we're continuing to run these trials through to 2028. Now, the key limitation is around fallow periods and availability of organic matter in fallow periods. So this is from the Facey Group site, where we grew some summer cover crops compared to a control fallow and then a sprayed out fallow. You can see there's no difference in treatments, and you can follow this through. So that's our total carbon, our total nitrogen declines towards the end of the season. So our POC, which is another form of labile carbon, it spikes in response to our cash crop peak biomass. So we grew 1 tonne of the hectare of summer cover crop, 6 tonne of the hectare of canola. We saw an increase in our labile carbon in response to that canola. So again, it's that in-season cash crop where we're producing that reliable and high biomass that is having an impact on our soil system. It doesn't translate in a single season to total carbon, but you can see it in these, I guess, precursors to that total soil carbon. If we have a look at the results from bird shit, so we've got our water-soluble carbon and our hot water extractable organic carbon. So this is winter-spring cover crops with diversity compared to wheat cash crop, lentil cash crop, and a long fallow. Again, no treatment differences, which was a little bit interesting. There was a really low biomass year across the board. The interesting thing to point out here, so Cassie talked about soil stoichiometry. So soil protein is protein available to soil microbes. We can see at baselines the start of the cash crop season. We terminate our cover crops to conserve water. So that was a roundabout and thesis and harvest of the cash crops for that year. And then in our fallow period up to sowing in 2022, so it didn't grow a summer cover crop, our bioavailable nitrogen, so the nitrogen for our soil microbes, the system crashes because we don't have those living roots in the ground. When we do that over a fallow period, so that compared to low biomass or paired with low biomass in that system, means that we start to mine our accumulated organic matter. So you can see the decrease in our labile carbon, so our fresh carbon inputs in response to this crash in bioavailable nitrogen. And then as the microbes will mine that organic matter, and then with water limitation over that dry summer for bird shit, with no living roots, we don't see any changes in soil carbon for the system. So we have this limitation in our soil carbon cycling in cropping system, which is sort of the key thing that I want to show with that, and explains why we haven't seen, I guess, those changes in our trials at Central West, at Rift Plains, because we're not sustaining that cycle, not having those continuous inputs, and it's a really big limitation for our cropping system. Cassie talked about soil constraints as well. I'm not going to go into too much because I'm sort of running a bit short on time, but this is a photo from Rift Plains. We have similar issues across Central West. We've got acidity in the topsoil, sodicity and alkaline soils in the subsoil, and so we get subsoil dispersion, really hard compact layer. Just should have put the photo up, but the canola this year goes down, happy enough in this acidic neutral layer, and then it grows at right angles when it hits that hard compacted layer. And the key thing I just want to highlight there, and especially around soil carbon like projects and participation with the Emissions Reduction Fund, the cropping opportunities at the moment are for agronomic based projects. So if you do have a soil constraint, do encourage you to take the time to find out about it to increase your biomass and promote that soil carbon cycling. And the reason why I promote this when I talk to farmers, because if you're addressing a soil constraint, if you're promoting your soil health, you're not just opening up your opportunities in market instruments, but you're going to promote higher yields as well across your system. And this is the beauty in talking about soil health and talking about soil carbon, is it's not just, am I having a project? Is it my market access? Is it my yield? These things, they feed into each other. As I spoke about before, around the benefits around plant diversity, but then also leveraging environmental credentials and maintaining a social license for market access. So even outside of the scope of carbon projects. So just to wrap up, there's evidence for diverse cropping systems with plant diversity to build soil carbon from the Northern Hemisphere and temperate systems. But because of our fallow system, because of limitations of biomass production, we still need a lot more work to be done in Australia on these systems and how we can best implement them. At the moment, summer cover crops are an opportunistic practice, so get them in to use up some extra water when you can produce high biomass. Temporary intercropping, it can improve soil health by having that, if it's in our example, wheat and vet, so that wheat and the legume in there. But intercropping, I think, is a really interesting one to watch because of that over yielding and high biomass production. The other thing that I didn't talk too much about, building total soil carbon is a really long process. So we need to understand those labile carbon measures and how we are impacting those. And I think from a personal perspective, one of the things that we need to see, it's really easy for the grading industry to pick it up, and they have, is looking at developing best practice for soil health and establishing environmental credentials for that market access for our growers. And that's all from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Abe. I've got a question here. What is the difference between organic N and plant N?
Organic N, so is nitrogen tied up with in like that soil organic matter. So in your microbial biomass, in your plant litter and stuff like that. And then plant N is, I guess, the mineral N that's available for plant growth.
Great, thanks, Abe. Has anybody got any more questions? You can put them in the Q&A or the chat. I think that might be everything. I'll just have another check. Excellent. Well, thank you, Abe, and thank you, Cassie, for those presentations. They were fantastic. And as I mentioned before, we will, Abe, I don't know whether you can go back. Oh, Felicity, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I also just popped in the Q&A, which I'm not sure if that can be shared in the chat, the link to a fact sheet for Abe's trial work on the Soil CRC website. So other people might be able to access it if possible. I was interested in the use of other tools for predicting soil carbon sequestration and the use of the CSIRO's Look-See, if that is of any use or if anyone has tried it, and whether it would be useful for Central West farmers to go in and put some scenarios around different land management practices for soil carbon potential.
I'll have first crack at that. The Look-See tool is useful for understanding, I guess, your potential scope for change. It's developed on the catalogue of data and understanding of practices that CSIRO has developed through their various like the SCARP project and various soil sampling surveys that they've conducted. And the way that it works is from their library of data, they've created what we call digital soil map products, which are just modelled soil properties on or you can get down to 30-metre spacings now for some of them across the continent. And LookSee just mines through those to estimate what the carbon for your farm is. So you'll put in your location, you'll put in some high-level details around management, and it'll give you an estimate of where it thinks you're at and where it thinks you can get to. If you know your carbon on your farm from your own testing, it's probably more beneficial to have a look at that to see what the upper limits are from LookSee. Because the thing that drives the distribution of soil carbon at that continental scale is climate and soil type. And so the on-farm variability is a lot higher than what is, I guess, captured in LookSee. So if you, as sort of like a first pass, it can be really useful to know your own carbon, then go to LookSee and then have a look at sort of the management options that are available to you that could increase carbon, and then compare where you're at with where LookSee puts or estimates the range of possible carbon values for your region. So really similar to what Cassie sort of showed with the spread of soil carbon across rainfall. LookSee can be really useful for that. The thing that I've found working with farmers and LookSee is that sometimes you put it in and you're in like the top percentile for soil carbon for your region as estimated from LookSee. And sometimes I've had some farmers look at that and sort of just go, well, why should I bother? I can't go any higher. I think the concept of the ceiling on soil carbon, especially around in a system that's managed, I guess, specifically to build soil carbon, is that ceiling is quite rubbery and quite, I guess there's a fair bit of uncertainty because we've just pulled, or sites have pulled so much data to throw it together. So don't, if you think you're sitting really high for your region, don't take that, or take that as really good for you. It's a box tick. But don't think you can't go higher just because LookSee says you can't. So there are limitations around that and a bit of nuance to understanding LookSee.
Cassie?
If I can just add to that as well, tools like LookSee and others are a really nice kind of snapshot to see what, to test a few different scenarios to look at impact of practice change. Something that we always need to keep in mind with any of our predictions or expectations of increasing carbon over time is that as I mentioned, carbon is very strongly related to rainfall and also results in fluxing according to those annual rainfall systems. So anything that we do to increase carbon, if we then hit a drought time or a really low rainfall time, that there's quite easily that environmental conditions will result in decreasing those numbers. So whilst over time we're looking to maintain or potentially increase our soil carbon numbers, but we need to appreciate reality may end up doing quite some big fluxing in there. So once we increase it, it's not set in stone for good. We do need to look at, what our variance may look like over our expected time frame of getting a benefit from it. That's all.
Thank you both. And I was interested in the soil types that Abe put up that Abe, you were working on in Central West. And just from memory, I think he had Curasol, Sodasol, and maybe Vertisol. Oh, there you go. My memory's not so bad after all. What's your expectation of those three soil types for, say, that maximum soil carbon potential, or do we know, or do we not know? So if somebody's saying, as I identified, well, I've got a Sodasol, there's probably some limitations there that they should be investigating for starters. But what if I've got a 1% in my Sodasol? could I possibly, with some changed practices, target a 2% or a 3% soil carbon potential, given the rainfall and farming system, etc.? Is that $1 million question?
I might handball that to Cassie because I don't like.
I guess that I really. Sorry, you go.
Oh no, sorry. I was just going to say I don't like committing to putting those kinds of numbers on those questions.
I guess at a really basic level, we know that CRC is a really big driver of ability to hold carbon. So at a very basic level, I guess we'd be looking at what the CRC in that surface soil looks like. And knowing that these soil types are a description of the profile to depth means that the variance in that profile may not be reflected in variance at that surface level where most of the carbon will be held. So I'd be looking at saying that soil texture is in that top 10 to 20 centimetres is probably more likely to be a key driver rather than that profile description. But Abe, if you wanted to play on, and Terry, yes, higher CRC, so which results in higher clay content, does have increased capacity to hold carbon through those chemical bonding structures. So where the organic matter specifically will bond with that clay, which can hold it a lot tighter than what we can get with our sands. So, yeah. Abe, did you want to comment further?
No, I think that's hit the nail on the head. And I think for the region as well, there is so much subsoil variability. So understanding and I guess getting your hands dirty and seeing what's out there is really important. But you can't while there's sort of that range of the low to high values and what we sort of expect to see within a soil, there's I think a lot more work to be done on pulling, or I guess like on the agronomic side of management, and what we know that going from crop to pasture to forest, we have an increase in soil carbon. I think what we quite haven't done as a scientific community quite yet is understood the nuances or the smaller changes within a system in terms of what management does for soil carbon. And so I think the range that we sort of expect, I think there's a bit of, as I sort of said before, there's a bit of rubberiness around how far these sort of systems can go as we get better understanding through things like the Cool Soil Initiative and what Cassie's doing on what the opportunities are for soil carbon increase within a given soil type or a given set of texture and soil conditions. I think that ceiling, I think there's room potentially to push that forward beyond our understanding of just soil chemical and physical properties limiting soil carbon and what the intricacies of management can actually do for that.
I think, I'm not sure. Yep, is everybody frozen? No, I can see a bit of movement. Sorry, my computer might have gone. So just to wrap up, it looks like no one has any more questions. And I'd just like to thank again Abe and Cassie and Felicity Harrop from Soil CRC for holding these webinars. We will be there'll be more webinars to come. You can look on the Soil CRC website, and Felicity will also provide us some details where other webinars will be held. They'll be held with other farming systems groups and other Soil CRC participants. And as I stated earlier, we will be sending all the attendees recording of this webinar. And if anybody has any questions or would like to contact anybody, any of the presenters, just contact me and I can pass you all on. I think that's about it. No more questions. So thank you, Abe. Thank you, Cassie, for your fantastic presentations. And we'll catch up again soon.
Thank you, Di.
Thanks, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for coming along.